There are many books, many essays, many YouTube videos about Marxist critiques of Christianity. The liberation theology branch of Christianity hoped to reinvigorate Christianity with its social justice mission that, according to those writers, was actually at the core of Jesus' teaching. And of course, many of the political movements based around socialism and communism in the past have harboured a deep negativity towards Christianity in particular. However, Buddhism seems to go largely unnoticed by these critiques. The idea of a slave morality put forward by Nietzsche, the idea that religious systems tended to be popular amongst slaves, in comforting slaves as an anaesthetic for slaves, and as a philosophy that slaves would encourage other slaves to adopt, seems to be mainly talked about with reference to Christianity and less so with Buddhism. Although, interestingly, Buddhism generally doesn't really, tell people to comply with their slavery or wage slavery, but instead retreat to monasteries. That seems to be much more of a big thing in Buddhism. However, a monastery is marked by material deprivation, by a kind of celebration of poverty that a Marxist might find interesting. Someone who views history through the eyes of historical materialism might take quite a dim view of Buddhism. In fact, I remember once watching a video about, it was a Chinese propaganda video, about why they were invading Tibet, and their basic argument was, look at these poor fools. They spend all of their time in absolute poverty, eating nothing but goat milk and rice gruel, meditating all day, owning nothing, and we, the communists, are going to go and liberate them from their poverty and make them more wealthy. That's interesting. Very interesting. In Laos, it unfolded very differently. I went to Laos. I've been to Southeast Asia. I love travelling in those countries. And whilst in countries like Cambodia, the Buddhists got basically genocided, all of the Buddhist monks pretty much killed by Pol Pot and his regime, his murderous regime, in Laos something quite interesting happened. The communists showed up and they looked at the Buddhist monks and they said, hang on a minute, aren't you guys kind of already communists? I mean, you live in communes for a start, you don't really have private property and ownership, you're generally kind of an egalitarian thing. You monks tend to treat one another as equals. Those guys with the fancy hats over there, we'll have to do something about them, the abbots and the Buddhist leaders and this kind of thing. We'll sort them out. But maybe the Buddhists and the communists can get along, actually. And lo and behold, they kind of did. Although, in Laos, I think the Buddhists became a part of the social services system in a way, a part of the welfare system to some extent. They helped to provide education and medicine and do the community bureaucracy a little bit. And one might argue that it's slightly less Buddhist as a result. One could argue that the purity of the monastic escape that is previously associated with Buddhism has been somewhat depleted. I think there is a bit of an issue with Buddhism because it puts, and poverty and inequality, because it puts the entire onus of suffering on the individual for the most part. It doesn't really at all talk about social conditions that give rise to suffering. Indeed, social conditions, being simply conditions, would never be suitable as a permanent source of satisfaction, according to a Buddhist. Just as in Christianity, the people are told, don't worry about your rich master, he's going to go to hell. In Buddhism, people are told, don't worry about your rich and nasty master, he will be reincarnated in some negative form, perhaps as an animal, perhaps as a lesser human, or something like this. So both Christianity and Buddhism in various forms do spin certain yarns designed to reduce the resentment and anger people feel towards those who have more power than they do. So, Buddhism could be beaten with that same stick, I suppose, as Christianity has been. I suppose also you could argue that Buddhism is just another opiate of the masses. After all, a person could go to the ruler and say, or even the Lama, let's say Tibet, saying, hang on a second, you Lamas are flying around in private jets and you're surrounded by golden statues, and the goat herders in the mountains are meant to be donating money to you, even though you kind of do nothing. I mean, meditating all day is good for people. It might make people more moral, but a lot of your time is spent not herding goats or tilling the soil like we have to do. And then the Lamas could just say, you just need to go and meditate more. If you meditate more, you'll see that this isn't a real problem. The suffering you're experienced is caused by your lack of self-discipline over your thoughts, and you just need to change the way you're thinking. Well, I don't think that is particularly satisfying for our Marxist critique. I suppose, though, one of the problems with this opiate of the masses line is that basically just about anything other than revolution could be called an opiate of the masses. Television is the opiate of the masses. Facebook is the opiate of the masses. Reading a book is the opiate of the masses. Anything that isn't actually toppling the bourgeoisie can be labelled as simply a pacifying distraction from the really important task of toppling the bourgeoisie. So I don't know if that critique is quite so watertight. But anyway, I think it's important. I mean, I love Buddhism and I love many of the teachings, but I think it's important to be critical of it. I think it's important to bring these Marxist critiques to Buddhism and ask the extent to which both the teachings and the practices of Buddhism, to some extent, actually kind of comply with the status quo and perhaps even help maintain it. That leads me to a rather bleak and dark view of Buddhist monasticism. When you look at Southeast Asian countries, you look at the history of them, often the people in power had many women. I remember visiting, what's that place called? Yes, Hue in Vietnam, and reading about the emperor, and he would have women brought from all over the country on a weekly basis, fresh virgins to service his phallus on a weekly basis, and presumably for each one of the virgins he would get through there and who would join his harem, there would be some man who was left without a woman. What could we do about that? Well, maybe we should make a place like a monastery or something where we send those men and we teach them to be at peace with their lack of pussy in their lives. Yeah, that'll do. We'll just get them to meditate enough on it and teach them that removing their desire, largely for women, actually, is essential to peace and enlightenment. Well, it's certainly essential to peace and enlightenment if all of the women have been shipped off to the emperor and there aren't any left for you. Certainly then you don't have too much choice but to meditate, or God forbid, hook up with someone of your own sex. We'll forbid that, whatever. So, you could argue that monasteries themselves are a part of a social system that is precisely designed to maintain the real privileges of the men at the top, because of course most of the people going into monasteries were men. That's the other thing. They didn't really feel the need to send women to monasteries. And now, of course, we also have a situation where a lot of men are not getting laid. We don't have monasteries to send them to brainwash them into feeling that that's a completely fine thing. And You know, I wonder if there's a thing there. You know, if the rulers knew that these guys, from a certain point of view in the monasteries, were potentially kind of suckers on that front. When you have a whole social system designed to channel a large portion of men into the army and a large portion of men into monasteries, well, that's going to really basically devalue women in the sexual marketplace and leave a lot of women for the rulers at the top who, funnily enough, don't need to be in the army or a monastery to basically have to themselves. So, you know, the bitter, cynical, pessimistic part of me does sometimes wonder if Buddhist monasteries served a certain function like that. God, this video is all over the place, isn't it? Really not one topic, but a whole load of ideas. I suppose I'm going to throw one more in there. I mean, as some of you know, I love monasteries. I've stayed in monasteries, and I think monasteries are actually really useful on both a personal and a social level. But I think a great deal about the way in which human beings create social systems that influence how genes have been selected. The selection of our genes through social processes and institutions, a kind of self-domestication process, essentially. How, for example, does the existence of prisons or mental asylums influence the genes that make it through to the next generation? And it seems to me that these institutions, when enough people engage with them, have a kind of slightly eugenic effect. There is an unconscious genetic selection, or I think unconscious, I would hope unconscious, genetic selection process that unfolds through them. Well, this points to something kind of disastrous about monasteries, because we have to wonder what kind of people are drawn to monastic living. Well, on the surface, we might say that the people drawn to Buddhist monasticism historically were potentially the people most concerned with truth and morality and cultivating virtue and things like that. And in theory, there might be a genetic correlation towards these dispositions, just as there might be a genetic correlation to being a greedy, selfish psychopath who loves to deceive and lie to people on the other side of it. So, potentially, the long history of monasteries over the last 2,000 years or so has actually constituted a disaster when it comes to human genetics. We've been almost systematically removing the best from the gene pool. And monks were often the most literate and intelligent people in a society as well. So we've basically been removing the most literate, most virtuous, and most truth-seeking individuals through the monastic system, which of course insists on celibacy, insists on those who engage with it not passing their genes on. The people who pass their genes on, for the most part, have been the serfs who actually sponsor these celibate monasteries. So, you know, it's worth considering the impact that monasteries have had on human genetics. Anyway, this rambling video is now coming to a close, so thank you so much for listening, and I hope you found some of those many topics interesting.